I've been asked 100 times why I stayed. The honest answer is that I didn't think about it. That sounds wrong when I say it out loud, sounds like I'm building a legend out of nothing, the way soldiers sometimes do when they've done something they can't explain, but it's the truth. I walked through the blast door of the medical wing, the evacuation klaxon still cycling overhead, and I saw a woman lying on a treatment slab who hadn't been moved. And I didn't calculate the odds. I didn't weigh my options. I just thought, somebody forgot her. That thought should have taken 2 seconds to correct. I should have grabbed her chart, flagged a transport medic, gone back to the shuttle line. That's the job. You move the wounded, you account for your personnel, you fall back in order. Field medicine isn't heroism. It's logistics with blood on it. 12 years in the Interplanetary Medical Corps had made that reflex as automatic as breathing. But the evacuation shuttles were already cycling their docking clamps. I could hear the deep percussion of it through the floor, the vibration that meant the bay seals were pressurizing for launch. And the woman on the slab was still there. I crossed to her. She was wearing the plain gray patient smock that the station issued to everyone who came through the ward, the kind of garment designed to erase rank, to make every body the same body, to let the medics focus on the wound and not the title. It had done its job. I hadn't recognized her. I hadn't been on Thorax Station long enough to know the faces. And in that gray smock, in that flat medical light, with her eyes closed and her breathing too shallow, she looked like any one of a dozen critical patients I'd worked on in the last 72 hours. I checked her chart first, the way you're supposed to. Blast injury, right leg, femoral secondary and deep tissue damage below the knee. A clean field regeneration cast was still cycling on the lower wound, its faint amber glow pulsing in a slow rhythm. Someone had started the treatment. Someone had also left without finishing it. I looked at her vitals on the display above the slab. Stable. Not good, not the kind of stable that means recovering, but stable in the way that means not dying this minute. The kind of stable you could move, if you moved carefully, if you had a transport litter and 2 more sets of hands, and about 6 minutes you didn't have. Outside the blast doors, through the station wall, I heard the first orbital strike hit the far ridge. The whole structure shuddered. A crack ran up the wall above the medication cabinet, not new, not immediately dangerous, but the kind of crack that has more to say later. The lights in the bay went to emergency amber. I made my decision. I secured the blast door from the inside. There was a manual lock, a big lever that the evac protocols specifically said not to engage because it would trap anyone still inside. I engaged it. I remember the sound it made, a dull iron thud, like a full stop at the end of a sentence, and I thought, well, there it is. Then I went back to the slab and started checking her lines. Her name I would not learn for another 4 hours. What I knew was this: she was tall, even lying down. Blue-gray skin, the particular shade of it that I'd seen in Vithari Nationals before, but finer in texture than I was used to, almost luminous under the amber emergency lighting. Her hair was dark, the deep blue-black of open space where light is just beginning to show, and it had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in, spreading across the slab in long, uneven waves. Her ears came to a soft upward point. Her hands, folded across her chest in the way of someone who had been unconscious long enough to settle into stillness, were long-fingered and precise-looking, the kind of hands that belong to someone who does careful, deliberate work. Her eyes were closed. I did what I always do. I worked. There is a quality to working under bombardment that nothing else quite replicates. The world outside is trying to end. The world inside your hands is one patient, one wound, one decision at a time. Some people find that contrast unbearable. I have always found it steadying. Every station posting I've had, every frontline rotation, every evac triage that went sideways, the part that never broke me was the work itself. The work is always clear. There is a wound. There is a treatment. You close the distance between the two. I upgraded her regeneration cast. The unit the station medics had initialized was doing basic work, holding the tissue together, but the blast had done more damage deeper in the leg than the standard scan had caught. I ran a secondary probe, found the full extent of it, reset the cast parameters. It would take 8 hours to finish what it had started. We had, by my rough estimate, about 3 hours before the next major bombardment wave, and considerably less if the warlord's fleet moved their fire corridor east. I told her this, out loud, even though she was unconscious. I've done that my whole career. The patients can't always hear you, and it doesn't always matter, but talking through what you're doing keeps your own thinking clean. You don't skip steps when you have to say them. Regeneration cast is recalibrated, I said. Your lower leg is going to hurt when you wake up, but it should be functional in 6 to 8 hours if the cast holds. I'm going to check your fluids, and then I'm going to find us a more defensible position inside this station, because the medical bay has 3 exterior walls, and I don't love that right now. She didn't answer. Her breathing steadied slightly, which I chose to take as a good sign. The station shook again, closer this time. I steadied the cast with my hand to keep it from losing contact with the wound, waited for the shudder to pass, then got on with it. I found a supplies corridor that ran along the interior spine of the station. No exterior walls, reinforced ceiling, stocked with emergency provisions and 2 additional portable med units. It would do. I wheeled her slab down to it manually, locked the unit's wheels, and set up what I could for a long wait. Then I sat down against the wall with her chart and started learning everything the chart could tell me. It wasn't much. She'd been admitted under a priority trauma intake code, which meant the admitting medic had bypassed standard registration. You do that in mass casualty situations when there's no time for the full intake process, when the wound is what matters and the paperwork can follow. So there was no name, no species full designation, no assigned ward. Just the injury, the treatment initiated, and a single notation at the bottom that said, in the clipped shorthand of a busy triage medic, Court intake, coordinate with admin Ray, room assignment. Court intake. I looked at her hands again, then at her face. There was a quality to her features that I had been reading as simply beautiful, in the alien way that Vithari nationals often were, something in the bone structure that read as composed and deliberate like architecture. But there was something else in it, something I'd seen before in the faces of people who were used to being looked at without being seen, a quality of containment, of having learned, very young, to keep the most important things behind the eyes. I didn't let myself think about it further. It didn't change anything about what needed to be done. I spent the first quiet stretch checking the station's internal communications, most of them down, the emergency broadcast frequency jammed by the fleet's interference net, but the IMP distress channel still clear. I sent a compressed emergency signal on that frequency. 2 wounded, 1 critical, supply corridor 7, thorax station. I gave the coordinates twice, included the bombardment pattern data so any rescue ship would know what approach vectors were covered. Then I settled in to wait and to monitor. Waiting is a skill that field medicine teaches you early and hard. In the Corps there is a saying, an old one, attributed to no one in particular, the kind of institutional wisdom that outlives its origin, that 90% of medicine is being present while the body does its own work. The cast was cycling. Her vitals were as good as they could be. The corridor was as secure as I could make it. There was nothing more to do with my hands, and so I did what you do. I held position and I let time pass. I am not, by nature, a person who finds waiting easy. There is a restlessness in me that I've managed across 12 years of field work but never entirely quieted. A tendency toward the next action, the next problem, the next task on the list. I've come to understand it as the shadow side of the same quality that makes me good at triage. The constant assessment of what else might need doing, running in the background even when nothing does. In the supply corridor, with the bombardment cycling outside, and the woman on the slab cycling through her own slow repairs. I let it run. I inventoried the supplies twice and arrived at the same numbers. I sketched out a rough map of the station's spine from memory, noting structural risk points, and assessed 3 alternate positions we could move to if the corridor became untenable. I thought about the fleet's orbital mechanics and what I knew about the warlord Rennek from 2 weeks of station briefings, which was not much. A regional power broker with greater ambition than resource base, which was the profile of someone who pushed hard early and calculated on speed rather than attrition. If he wanted a demonstration rather than a ruin, we had time. I thought about how strange it was to be reasoning about orbital strategy. I'm a medic. I know how to stop bleeding and restart breathing and hold a person's body together while their own systems figure out what to do next. The fleet politics were out of my competency entirely, and yet here I was, triangulating a warlord's psychology because it was the information available, and I needed to understand the shape of the next several hours. This is the other thing field work teaches you, eventually. You use what you have. The mission is always the same: keep the patient alive, get them out, and everything that stands between you and that outcome is a problem to be solved with whatever tools you were carrying when it started. Today's tools were a recalibrated regeneration cast, a distress signal on a frequency that might or might not be monitored, a core medic's knowledge of triage and supply management, and 2 weeks of briefings about a warlord who wanted to win quickly. It wasn't nothing. I checked her vitals again at the 90-minute mark and was satisfied by what I saw. At the 2-hour mark, I ate half a ration bar from the supplies and forced myself to stop at half, not because I wasn't hungry, but because we didn't know how long this was going to run, and rationing is a discipline you establish early or it slips. I kept talking to her intermittently. Not constantly. I'm not a person who needs to fill silence, but in the intervals where my thinking had run its course on the immediate problems, and there was simply the waiting left. I told her about the station's structural condition as I assessed it. I told her what I knew about regeneration cast chemistry and why the recalibrated settings would serve her better. At one point, in a quiet stretch, I found myself telling her about the fog. The plateau that Thurex station sat on was famous for it, a permanent low-cloud layer that rolled in from the eastern cliffs every evening and burned off by mid-morning, the result of some interaction between the terrain and the local ocean that meteorologists had explained, and everyone had immediately forgotten because the effect was simpler and more interesting than the explanation. 11 days into my posting, I had gotten up early enough to watch the burn-off from the station's observation level. The fog went from opaque to translucent to a series of thinning veils, and then, over the space of about 20 minutes, to nothing. And below it, the plateau was green and wet, and entirely different from the dry administrative surface the fog had covered. Like a second world underneath the first. I told her that. She was unconscious. It didn't matter. I told it anyway because it was in my head and because, in the particular silence of that corridor, it felt like something worth saying aloud. The second orbital strike hit at roughly the 2-hour mark. This one was different in character from the first, not a ranging shot, but a sustained sequence, as if the warlord's targeting had found a particular section of the station and was committed to opening it. I could hear the structural responses, the groan and crack of it, the way the corridor's ceiling flexed slightly at each impact. A conduit along the upper wall split and rained insulation material, which I swept out of the way methodically. The emergency lighting flickered twice, held, then shifted to the deeper red of backup power. I checked her vitals through all of it, steady. The regeneration cast maintained contact. Her face in the red backup light was very still. I found myself talking to her again. Not the clinical running commentary of the first hour, that was over. I'd done what needed doing, but something else. The kind of talking you do when it's very late and very loud outside, and the silence inside your own head is worse than the noise. I told her about the care system posting. About the 11 months in the settlement, and the particular learning curve of being the only medical resource for 400 people when you'd been trained for field corps operations, not community practice. About delivering a child in conditions that would have made my instructors weep. About the small girl, maybe 7 years old, who had come to the clinic every single day for a month after her brother's treatment just to sit in the waiting room and watch the door, as if she needed to verify with her own eyes that the place was still open, still there, still operating. I still think about that girl sometimes, the particular quality of her attention, the way she sat with her small hands folded, watching the door. There was something in it that I recognized even at the time as a kind of faith, but a faith that had already learned to check its work. The second bombardment wave passed. Silence returned, or the station's version of it. The deep structural groaning of a building that has taken damage and is deciding how much of it to absorb. I checked my watch, 2 hours and 40 minutes since I'd found her. I refilled my water flask from the supply locker, then sat back against the wall and watched the steady amber pulse of her regeneration cast. In the red backup light, it looked different, the amber and the red mixing into something warm, almost fire-like. She woke 4 hours and 17 minutes after I found her. I know the time because I was cataloging our supplies, and I had just written the hour in my log when I heard her breathing change, from the slow, medicated rhythm of unconsciousness to the sharper, guarded rhythm of someone coming back to themselves in an unfamiliar place. I moved to her side and spoke first, calmly, the way you do with patients who wake disoriented. "You're in a supply corridor at Thorax Station," I said. "I'm Calder Wren, Field Medic, Imp Corps. You were left in the medical bay when the evacuation launched. I stayed with you. You're stable, your leg is healing. You're safe for now." A pause, then her eyes opened. They were gold. Not amber, not yellow-brown, a deep, clear, burnished gold, the color of something that has been refined down to its essential nature. They moved to my face with a steadiness that told me she was not, despite the 4 hours of unconsciousness and the blast wound and the bombardment, a person who frightened easily. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice roughened by sleep but precise, "You stayed." "Yes." "Why?" "Because you were still here." It wasn't an eloquent answer. I've thought about it since and I'm not sure I could have done better. She was there. That was the reason. The evacuation order had been for all personnel and she was personnel and she was still there, and so I stayed. She seemed to think about this. Her gold eyes moved across the corridor, the supplies stacked along the walls, the portable med units, the faint amber of the cast against the deeper red of backup lighting, and I watched her assemble the picture of where she was and what had happened, the way capable people do, quickly, quietly, without asking for help. "How long have we been here?" she said. 4 hours, roughly, since the main evacuation launched. The bombardment. 2 waves so far. The station structure is holding. The medical wing took damage to the exterior wall, that's why I moved us here. No exterior exposure. We have supplies for 6 to 8 days if we ration, which we won't need. I've been monitoring the fleet's fire pattern. There's a lull in their corridor coverage every 4 to 6 hours. I've sent a distress signal on the IMP emergency frequency. Someone will come. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You recalibrated my regeneration cast." The initial settings weren't catching the full extent of the damage. It should finish the primary repair in about 4 more hours. She looked down at her leg, at the steady amber pulse of the cast, then back at me. "I remember the triage medic," she said. "There were many wounded. She worked very fast." "She did good work, she just ran out of time." Yes, a beat, as did everyone else. There was something in that sentence, not bitterness exactly, something more controlled than bitterness. Something that had looked at a fact and was choosing not to weep over it, Not because the fact wasn't painful, but because weeping wasn't useful. I recognized that quality. I had spent 12 years cultivating it in myself. "Are you in pain?" I asked. "Some. It is manageable." She shifted slightly on the slab, repositioning with the careful deliberateness of someone who knows exactly where their body's limits are. "What is your name again?" "Calderin." "Human?" "Yes." "ImpCor?" "Field medic, yes. I was posted to the station garrison 2 weeks ago as a diplomatic rotation liaison. Wrong place, wrong time." I paused. "Or the right one, depending how you look at it." Something moved in her expression. Not a smile, not quite. Something quieter than a smile, more considered. Like a thought that had arrived, and was being examined before being acted on. "I am Vareth," she said. Just the name. No title. No house designation, no rank suffix, none of the formal apparatus that Vithari nobility attached to their names like armor. Just Vareth. "Vareth," I said, "is there anything you need right now?" "Water," she said. "And then, if you are willing, I would like to know more about the fire pattern you have been monitoring. I was a military strategist before I took on other responsibilities. I may be able to help you anticipate the fleet's movements." I got her the water. Then I pulled out my charts, and we went to work. I will say this about the hours that followed. They were not what I would have expected if you'd asked me beforehand to imagine spending the night in a collapsing station with a wounded VIP waiting for rescue. I would have imagined the long silences, the mounting tension, the weight of not knowing whether the next strike would be the one that brought the ceiling down. I would have imagined, being honest, some version of endurance, of two strangers in a bad situation simply getting through it. That's not what it was. Vareth was, I don't have a better word for this, extraordinary company. Not in the showy sense. She didn't tell dramatic stories or perform cleverness. She was quiet, measured, precise in everything she said, but she noticed things. She noticed the fire pattern in my charts within 6 minutes and identified a rotation I'd missed that changed my projected lull window by 40 minutes. She noticed, without commenting on it, that I was rationing my water more aggressively than I was rationing hers, and the third time she caught me doing it, she simply slid her flask to the midpoint between us and said, in a tone that made further argument pointless, "Equal measure. You are no use to either of us dehydrated." She asked questions carefully, not the probing, political questions of someone assessing an asset, the genuine questions of someone who wanted to understand. She asked me about the ImpCor, about what had brought me to this particular posting, about what field medicine was like in the first hours after a major engagement. She listened to the answers with the complete attention of someone for whom listening was a skill, not a courtesy. I asked her about military strategy in return, the Vithari method of it, which I'd studied at the Corps Academy mostly in the abstract. She described it in terms I hadn't encountered in any textbook, not as a science but as a form of reading. You read the opposing commander, she said. Not their fleet movements, not their resource allocation, those were downstream of the commander's character. You read what they were afraid to lose, and you read what they believed they could afford to sacrifice. And when you understood those two things, you understood the battle before it began. "And Rennek," I said, "that was the warlord, the name I'd picked up from the station briefings during my 2 weeks on posting. What are you reading in him?" She considered this, with the same careful patience she brought to everything. "He is afraid of irrelevance," she said. "He has taken this system because it sits on the edge of the trade corridor, visible to the major powers, a statement of capability. But he doesn't intend to hold it long-term. It costs more than it produces. This is a demonstration, not an acquisition. He wants it to appear difficult enough to have been worth the effort." She paused. "Which means he will not push deep into the station's interior. Destroying the structure entirely would cost him the optics of a clean victory. He wants rubble on the edges and the central facility intact enough to occupy, if only briefly. I looked at the ceiling. So we're not in danger of the structure collapsing, I said. Not from intent, from miscalculation, always possible, but I believe we are safe enough here in the spine. That's a better prognosis than I had an hour ago, I said. I told you I might be useful, not boastful, just accurate. That was a quality she had throughout that night, a precise relationship with her own capabilities. She knew what she was good at, and she stated it plainly, without the performance of false modesty and without the performance of pride. It was simply information, offered when relevant. I found it remarkable in a way I couldn't quite articulate at the time. I've thought about it since, and I think what I was registering was the absence of the usual noise, the social static that most people generate around their own abilities, the constant adjustment for audience, the calculation of how much to seem and how much to conceal. She had none of that. She was exactly what she was, stated plainly. Somewhere in the 5th hour, when we had been through 3 more assessments of her leg's progress and a thorough discussion of the fleet's likely timetable, the conversation moved into quieter territory. The 3rd bombardment wave had come and gone, lighter than the 2nd, confirming her reading of Rennick's intent. The corridor was settled. Outside it was still a war. Inside it was 2 people in a small space with amber light and time. She asked me where I was from originally, not the Corps posting history where I was from. I told her, a northern coast settlement on the 4th continent, the kind of place with 4 months of good weather and 8 months of weather you learn to stop complaining about. Fishing boats and ore processing and a medical outpost that served 3,000 people. Not a large place, not a famous one. A place where you learned early that if the work didn't get done you did it yourself, because there was no one else nearby who was going to. That explains several things, she said. Does it? The self-sufficiency, the lack of hierarchy reflex. She looked at me with those considering gold eyes. Most people from institutional backgrounds, Corps officers especially, have a strong instinct for where they rank in a given room. You don't seem to have that at all. It never seemed like the most important information, I said. No, she said, I imagine it didn't. A pause. It is more unusual than you think. I asked her the same question in return. Where she was from, originally, before everything else. She was quiet for a moment, not reluctant exactly, but choosing how much to say and from which angle. I was born in the eastern reaches, she said. On the coast as well, as it happens. Our coastlines have different weather, very warm, very still for most of the year. The water is a deep green. When I was a child, before the succession before I understood what it would mean, I spent most of my free hours on the water. Small boat. My own, given to me by my father when I was 9. He believed that a person should have something that was theirs alone and that they tended themselves. He sounds like someone I'd have liked, I said. He died 12 years ago. She said it plainly without softening. He was the one person in my life who consistently forgot that I had a title. He would speak to me as though I were simply his daughter, which was both aggravating and, in retrospect, the great gift of my early life. She paused. I have been trying to locate that quality in other people ever since. I find it rarely. What does it look like when you find it? I asked. She looked at me for a moment. Like this, she said quietly. Like a man who stayed because I was there, without knowing or caring what I was, who talked to me about fire pattern charts and care system settlements and didn't once adjust his register or his manner or the space he was taking up in the room, because there was no calculation to make. I didn't know what to say to that. I'm not sure there was anything to say that wouldn't have been either too much or too little, so I just stayed where I was. May I ask you something personal? She said. Yes, I said. When you found me in the medical bay, before you knew anything about me, when I was simply an uncatalogued patient in a gray smock, did you know that you would stay? I thought about it. The honest answer was the same one I'd given at the beginning to the ceiling to myself. No, I hadn't decided exactly. It hadn't felt like a decision. I looked at you, I said, and you were still there. That was enough. She was quiet for a long moment. In the amber light, I could see something working its way through her expression, something that was happening behind the eyes, in that interior place she kept so carefully. "You should know," she said at last, "that my Chamberlain gave the evacuation order. He has administrative authority to do so in a crisis. He would have assessed the situation, my wound, the timeline, the political complications of a prolonged rescue operation, and he would have made a calculation." "I know that kind of calculation," I said. "Yes, I expect you do." She looked at me steadily. "I want you to understand that I am not surprised by it. I have been in positions of authority for a long time. I understand that I am often, to the people around me, primarily a piece on a board, a resource to be deployed or written off. This is the nature of power. I have made peace with it mostly." "Mostly," I said. The corner of her mouth moved. "Mostly," she agreed. The third bombardment wave hit then, the heaviest one yet, a long sustained series that walked up the station's eastern edge and made the supply corridor groan in ways I didn't love. I kept my hand on her cast to hold it in place. She didn't flinch. She watched the ceiling with those gold eyes, and her face stayed exactly as composed as it always was, though I noticed her hands had closed into loose fists at her sides. When it passed, she uncurled her fingers deliberately, one at a time. It was such a small gesture. I noticed it precisely because it was small, the deliberate act of choosing not to let the tension stay in the hands. The private discipline of a person who had long practice at composing herself, not for an audience but because composure was a tool she depended on. I thought about that gesture for a long time afterward. "Your signal," she said. "When was the last ping?" I checked. 2 hours ago. Response window should be opening in the next 40 minutes. "Good," she settled back. "Tell me something." "What do you want to know?" "Why field medicine? Of all the paths available to a human of your evident capability, why this one?" I'd been asked that before. The answer I usually gave was a functional one. I'd been good at it. I'd had training in the direction. The Corps had needed people. All true. But it wasn't the whole truth, and somewhere in the last 4 hours Verith had become someone I didn't want to give the partial version to. "I had a year early in my posting," I said, "where I was attached to a diplomatic mission in the care system, mostly observation, lots of waiting, and there was a settlement, a small Vithari settlement actually in the outer ring that had lost their medical staff in a supply ship accident. There was nobody. They had injured people and no one to treat them. I was the closest thing to a medic within range." I paused. "I was there for 11 months before the replacement staff arrived." 11 months, she said. It was clarifying, being that necessary. Not because I wanted to be needed exactly, but because the need was so clean. There was no ambiguity in any of it. Someone was sick or they were hurt, and I either knew what to do or I figured it out and then I did it. The rest of it, the institutional politics, the posting decisions, the question of where you rank and what it means, all of that fell away completely. There was just the work. And after 11 months, when the replacement staff came, I didn't want to leave. I paused. I asked to stay on for another rotation. They said no, the posting had served its purpose and the Corps had other assignments. I understood the logic. I still didn't want to go. I looked at the ceiling. There was a girl, maybe 7 years old, a local family, who used to come to the clinic every day and sit in the waiting room. She'd been there when I treated her brother early in the posting, and after that she just kept coming. Every day. Sitting with her hands folded, watching the door, like she was making sure the clinic was still open. Verith was watching me carefully. "I think she was afraid that if she stopped checking it would close," I said. "That the responsible adult who showed up and did the work would eventually leave. The way every responsible adult eventually leaves if you're small enough, and in a place small enough that you don't warrant permanence. But you stayed, Verith said, for 11 months. And then I left anyway, I said, and I still don't know what she made of that. A silence that had weight in it. You think about her, Verith said. I think about her every time someone asks why I do this work. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't read in full, something layered in it, something that had taken in what I'd said and was holding it alongside other things, comparing it to older knowledge. The reason you stayed, she said at last slowly, is that she was still there. The reason you stayed for 11 months is that they needed someone who would remain. And the reason you are here now in this corridor is the same reason. She paused. You are a man who stays, Calder Wren. It is not a strategy or a calculation. It is simply what you do. I hadn't thought of it that way, I said. I have been thinking of very little else for the last several hours, she said. The rescue shuttle's signal came through 38 minutes later, right on the window I'd predicted. I helped her to the outer dock, the two of us moving slowly because of her leg, her hand on my arm for the uneven sections where the floor had buckled. She didn't lean heavily, but she let me be useful, which I've learned is its own form of trust. Some people, powerful people especially, can't allow themselves to need assistance even when they need it. They walk too fast, they refuse the hand, they demonstrate capability when the demonstration costs them more than the help would have. She did none of that. She went at the pace her leg allowed. She took the arm when the floor demanded it, and she held her head exactly as she always held it, level, forward, unhurried. The shuttle bay door opened, and there were 6 armored figures, Royal Guard. I recognized the insignia. And behind them, in the pressed uniform of Senior Court Administration, a pale and sweating man whom I did not know but whom Verith looked at with an expression I can only describe as very careful. The Chamberlain. He began speaking immediately. An explanation, or what he meant to be an explanation, the tactical situation, the timeline, the assessment of survivability, the difficult decision made under pressure for the good of the succession. His voice had the smooth, practiced quality of a man who had prepared this speech and believed it would work. He spoke about the fleet's projected bombardment pattern, about the medical assessment of her transport risk, about the 12 other wounded personnel who had required immediate evacuation, and the impossible arithmetic of a mass casualty triage. He spoke about duty and necessity, and the weight of hard decisions, and the trust she had placed in him over many years of service. He did not apologize. The speech was constructed very deliberately to explain rather than to apologize, because an explanation was defensible, and an apology was an admission. Verith let him finish. Then she looked past him to the guard captain and said, in the quiet, absolute tone of someone who doesn't raise their voice because they don't need to, "Detain him. We'll address his conduct in full when we're back aboard." The Chamberlain went very still. The guard captain, a broad-shouldered older woman whose face gave nothing away, stepped forward and spoke a single quiet word to the 2 nearest guards. They moved without hesitation. The Chamberlain opened his mouth once more, something still forming on his lips, the second phase of the prepared speech, the escalation, and then he looked at Verith's face and closed it again. She turned to the guard captain, who had come forward with a portable brace for her leg. She accepted it, let the captain help her into stability with the same lack of pride she'd shown me in the corridor. Then she turned back to me. I was still standing slightly apart from the group, in the way you do when you're a liaison medic from a different corps and the political machinery of someone else's court is reorganizing itself around you. I had done my job. I had kept her alive and kept her company and gotten them both out of a collapsing station. That was the assignment. The rest wasn't mine to be part of. But she was looking at me, and the rest of her court was looking at where she was looking, which was its own kind of declaration. The guard captain's expression had shifted slightly. The guards behind her were standing with a particular stillness, not at ease, not at attention, but in the suspension of people who are registering that something significant is about to happen. "Captain Sorvith," Vareth said to the guard captain, without looking away from me, "what is the appropriate address for a human who has rendered extraordinary personal service to the crown of the Vithari Reaches?" There was a silence in the shuttle bay that had a particular texture to it. The guard captain, the older woman with the careful face of someone who had seen 30 years of service, said, "There is no formal protocol, Your Grace. The treaties don't address it." "Then we'll establish one." Vareth held my eyes. "He is to be addressed as Orvith Kale. It means, as closely as it translates, one who remained. It is a very old designation. We give it to no one lightly." I heard the sound that passed through the assembled guard, not words, something quieter. An intake, collective, the sound of a group of people recalibrating something. One of the younger guards, standing to the captain's left, straightened incrementally, the way people do when they are adjusting to a fact that has changed the shape of the room. "Your Grace," I said, "I just did my job." "No," she said, and there was something in her voice now, something that was not the contained quality, not the careful composure, but the thing underneath it, the thing she kept behind her eyes. "You did considerably more than that, and I will not allow you to tell the smaller version of the story." I didn't know what to say. In 12 years of field medicine I had been thanked in many ways, sometimes elaborately, sometimes not at all, and I had always found the gratitude uncomfortable in proportion to its size. This was not gratitude exactly. It felt like something being said on the record, for the benefit of everyone in the room, and maybe for the benefit of the record itself. She was naming what had happened, precisely and aloud, so that no one afterward could uncall it by another name. The guard captain was watching her with something in her face that I recognized as old loyalty, the kind you develop not for a title, but for the person wearing it, the person you've served long enough to know what they're actually made of. Several of the other guards were standing differently than they had been a minute ago. The chamberlain, still between his two guards, was very carefully not looking at anyone. "We need to get you aboard and run a proper scan on that leg," I said, because I am a medic and that was true, and I needed to say something that I knew how to say. The corner of her mouth moved again, the same almost smile from hours ago, more certain now. "Yes," she said, "we do." "Walk with me, Calder Wren." I walked with her. The shuttle bay was cold, and the light was the flat white of practical spaces. Nothing soft about it, nothing designed for the moment it was hosting. Through the viewport, Thurak Station was still taking hits along its eastern edge, the distant strikes visible as brief orange blossoms against the fog-locked plateau. A battle going on. A war with its own mathematics, its own momentum, its own 1,000 calculations being made by 1,000 different people in 1,000 different rooms. In one room, earlier that day, every one of those calculations had reached the same conclusion and left. I hadn't done a calculation. I had looked at a woman who was still there, and I had stayed. On the shuttle, when we had cleared the station's immediate envelope, and the ride had smoothed to the quieter motion of deep approach, she asked me whether I intended to continue my Imp Corps posting, or whether the events at Thurak Station had fulfilled the term of my diplomatic rotation. I told her that was up to the Corps. She told me, in the perfectly even tone of someone who was not making a request, merely observing a fact. The Vithari Reaches have need of a medical liaison with the Imp Corps. The posting has been vacant for 2 years. It would be a formal appointment direct to the Crown staff. I looked at her. "Your chamberlain," I said carefully, "is going to make things complicated." "My former chamberlain," she said, "is going to be considerably occupied with other matters for the foreseeable future. Yes," she held my eyes, "I am asking you to stay, Calder Wren, formally, as a matter of record." She was asking me, Not instructing, not deploying, not calculating, asking. I thought about what she'd said in the supply corridor, about the 19 years, and the people who remained because of what she represented, and the very rare quality of a room where someone stayed simply because she was there. I thought about what she'd said about her father, and the small boat on the green water, and the man who spoke to her as if she were simply his daughter. She was asking because she wouldn't do it any other way, because she was done with the version of things where people arranged themselves around her without being asked. Yes, I said. No ceremony in it, no flourish, just the word the same way I'd told her I stayed, because it was true and it was the only word needed. She looked at me for a moment, those clear gold eyes, that expression that always contained more than it showed. And then she turned back to the viewport where the station was still burning on the plateau below, the fog catching the light of the distant fires and turning it amber. Good, she said quietly. We flew away from Thurex Station through the early pale light of the system's dawn, the fleet's corridor shifting behind us, the burning outpost receding into the fog. I watched the light change on her face, the flat shuttle interior giving way to something warmer as the sun came up, gold finding the blue-gray of her skin and making something fine of it. She was looking at the horizon, at whatever came next. The leg brace hummed softly. The cast beneath it held. I've been asked 100 times why I stayed. I've thought about the answer from every angle I know, and it always comes back to the same thing. There was a woman on a slab who hadn't been moved, and she was still there, and that was the fact that mattered. Not the calculus of rank or risk or strategic benefit. Not the title I would learn 4 hours later, the title that made everyone else's abandonment comprehensible and changed nothing about my decision. Just a person, present, needing someone to stay. And here is what I have learned in the months since, that the rarest thing is not courage, not competence, not even kindness. Those things are common enough if you look in the right places. The rarest thing is the willingness to let the moment be what it is, to look at a person rather than looking at what they represent, to make the small, unambiguous choice to remain when the door is right there, and the math says leave. She named it Orvith Kale and said it was an old designation, not given lightly. I think what she was naming was not just what I did on the day of the bombardment, but a way of being in the world, the decision, made long ago and remade every day since, to be the kind of person who stays. I think about the girl in the waiting room with her small folded hands. I think about the 11 months I stayed and the day I left, and the way I've carried both of those facts for years without quite knowing how to reconcile them. I think I'm beginning to. The horizon opened ahead of us. We flew into it together. That's what I've told people when they ask. A clean version, the true outline of it. What I haven't told most people is the 4th bombardment wave. It came at the 6-hour mark, roughly 2 hours before the rescue signal arrived. The first 3 had followed the pattern Vareth had mapped, predictable increments, Eastern Corridor focus, Rennex fleet checking its work rather than extending it. The 4th didn't follow the pattern. It came from the south, a different ship or a repositioned one, and it struck the supply wing's junction with the station's central spine. The section of structure that, on my internal map, was 40 meters from where we were sitting. The corridor moved. Not catastrophically. The floor lurched once hard, and a section of the upper shelving came down along the right wall, supplies, mostly sealed containers, nothing immediately dangerous, and the emergency lighting cut out entirely for 11 seconds. 11 seconds of complete darkness and impact noise. The deep structural protest of a building absorbing force it was not designed for. I had been sitting with my back against the left wall, charts in hand. In the first second I pushed off and moved to her slab entirely by feel, got both hands on the cast to hold it in place, locked my body against the side of the slab so that any further movement would push me and not the equipment. Then I held on and waited. When the lights came back, the deepest red of tertiary backup, barely enough to see, I did a quick sweep. Ceiling intact. No new cracks in the immediate stretch of corridor. The shelving debris had landed in the space I'd been sitting, not in her space. The cast was holding. Her vitals display had flickered, but the numbers were back and they were steady. I looked at her face. She was watching me. Not the ceiling, not the debris field, not the vitals display, me. And there was something in her expression that I had not seen there before. Not fear. Fear was not a thing I would ever see in that face, or not simply. It was something more specific than fear, and more dignified. The look of someone who had just watched another person make a physical choice without thinking about it, and was taking the full measure of that choice. "You're all right," I said. "Yes," her voice was completely even. "You moved very fast." "Reflex," I said. "Yes," she said again. "I imagine it was." There was a quality to the way she said it. I didn't try to explain it away or diminish it further. I just checked the cast settings, confirmed the hold, and cleared some of the debris from the floor around the slab so we had clearer egress if we needed it. When I sat back down on the floor, closer to the slab now, the debris having claimed my previous position, she spoke after a short silence. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right." 3 weeks before the bombardment, before the delegation came to Thurak Station, I had a conversation with my senior advisor, the one who holds the long-range policy brief for the Reaches. She paused. He told me, in very measured and diplomatic language, that the court had concerns about the current trajectory of my tenure. That I had become, his word was isolated. That I operated from the center of a large administrative apparatus and yet made decisions as if I were working alone, consulting narrowly, trusting few. Was he right? I said. Largely, yes, she said it without apparent difficulty. It is a pattern I recognized in myself some years ago. When you have been in authority long enough and when you have learned, as I had learned by a number of instructive experiences, that the people around you often have agendas that run parallel to yours rather than with you, you begin to narrow. You trust the work you can do yourself. You keep your own counsel. She looked at the ceiling. It is a functional adaptation, and it is also, over time, a kind of diminishment. You become very good at operating without reliance on others, and you lose something in the process. The advisor was correct. I didn't tell him so. Why not? Because telling him would have required me to trust him with the acknowledgement, and I had not yet decided whether he had earned it. A pause. That is the trap, of course. You cannot rebuild trust without extending it, and you cannot extend it without risk. And the risk is the thing you have spent years learning to minimize. I thought about this. The girl in the waiting room, I said. The one I told you about, she came back every day because she needed to verify that the clinic was still open, still trustworthy. She had to keep checking, because the reliable thing had not been reliable long enough for her to stop checking. Yes, Vareth said, that is exactly the mechanism. How long would it take, I said, before she could stop checking? A long silence. Not the silence of someone who didn't know the answer, but of someone turning it over carefully, making sure of it before committing to it. A very long time, she said at last. A long time of consistent, unremarkable reliability. Not a dramatic gesture, those can be constructed and the checking part of the mind knows it. The everyday version of it. The ordinary staying. We sat with that for a while. Outside in the war, Renek's fleet was doing what fleets do, repositioning, recalculating, pursuing the incremental logic of a campaign that had its own momentum now. Inside the corridor, the tertiary lights hummed their deep red. The regeneration cast pulsed amber. The supply containers that had come down from the shelving were stacked against the wall where I'd moved them, orderly now, their disorder corrected. Can I ask you something? I said. Yes. In 19 years, have you ever just left? Not abdicated, not delegated formally, just gotten into a small boat and gone out on the water, the way you did when you were 9. A long pause. Something shifted in her face, not opened exactly, but unlocked slightly, the way a very old door moves when someone finds the right pressure. Once, she said, 7 years ago, there was a crisis, a trade dispute actually, the kind that feels enormous when you're in the middle of it and seems small in retrospect. And I was in the capital for 62 consecutive days without leaving the administrative complex. My steward, who has been with me for a very long time and who treats me, I think, closer to how my father did than anyone else in my life, knocked on my chamber door at 11 in the evening and told me there was a vessel at the private dock. He said, "Your Grace, the crisis will still be a crisis in the morning." And you went. I went. 4 hours in the dark on the water, alone. She paused. It did not solve the trade dispute. But I came back a different shape, she said. Harder in the places that needed to be harder and less brittle in the places that had been about to break. A pause. My steward has never once explained how he knew. I have never once asked him. He stayed, I said. She looked at me. He stayed, she agreed. The fifth wave, a small one, more of an echo of the fourth. The fleet's fire decaying as Vareth had predicted it would, came and went without incident. After it, the silence that settled into the corridor had a quality I recognized as the last phase of a long night. The particular quiet that comes when the worst has passed, and what remains is only the waiting for rescue. I checked her cast one more time. The repair had progressed well past the halfway point. When she walked out of this station, she would walk with a brace and some pain, and the cast's final work still completing, but she would walk. The posting, she said after a while, the medical liaison role. I want you to know what it would actually involve before you agree to it. You can tell me after we're off the station, I said. I prefer to tell you now, so that you are deciding with full information, not out of the context of this corridor and this night. I settled back against the wall. All right. The Reaches have a complex medical infrastructure across 11 inhabited systems. The IMP core interface has deteriorated significantly in the last 2 years. It was maintained by a career diplomat who understood administration but not medicine, and the protocols have drifted out of alignment in ways that cause real problems during crises like this one. The role requires someone who understands both sides, the core operational structure and the realities of field medicine. She paused. It is not a glamorous posting. There is a great deal of paperwork. There are interminable meetings between people who speak different institutional languages and cannot understand why the other party seems to be obstructing them. There are field rotations to the outer systems that are uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous. That sounds, I said, like every posting I've ever wanted. Something in her expression settled, a quiet resolution of something that had been held in question. There is one more thing, she said. Yes. I am asking because I believe you are the right person for the role. The professional assessment and the personal assessment point to the same conclusion, and I have learned over time to trust that alignment when it occurs. She held my eyes. But I am also asking because I would like, for reasons that are not entirely professional, for you to remain in reasonable proximity. She said it plainly, not declaratively, not with the weight of a statement of intent, just plainly, as information offered when relevant. I thought about 11 months in the care system. I thought about the small boat on the green water. I thought about the girl in the waiting room with her careful folded hands, verifying the clinic one more day at a time. Yes, I said. She nodded once, the small decisive nod of someone closing a matter. And then, because she was who she was, she turned the conversation back to the fleet's projected withdrawal timeline, and we spent the remaining 40 minutes working through it with the same focused attention we'd brought to everything else. The rescue signal came when she had just completed a projection I thought was almost certainly right. You'll want to write that down, I said. The withdrawal estimate. I have it, she said, touching her temple. I have a very good memory. I don't doubt it. She looked at me, that almost smile again. Are you ready? Yes, I said, let's go. And we went.